right, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for coming today and filling up the room. My name is John. Today we're going to talk a little bit about storytelling, a little bit about learning, think about it in the context of generative AI. Have everybody heard of that before, generative AI? Hasn't been talked about that much, right? So we're going to talk about all those things. We're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at MasterClass around storytelling and learning. I'm very sad to say that our Chief People Officer, Mel, was not able to come today. She fell ill, lost her voice, and kind of a prerequisite for speaking here is to have the voice. So she's not here. You're stuck with me. I'm our head of learning design and strategy at MasterClass, and really specifically focusing on MasterClass at work. So this is our programming for organizations to help them develop key skills among their employees. I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in that area, but that's really been my focus. But my journey in education started almost 20 years ago as a public school teacher in New York City, where I worked with students who were incarcerated. These were juveniles who had been accused of various crimes ranging from drug possession all the way up to murder. They were facing, some of them, many years inside of detention centers. And incredible experience, and one of the things you recognize working in that environment is that when you're so resource constrained, it unlocks incredible creativity. So these students every day exhibited amazing creativity for good and for not so good kinds of things. So sharpening objects into weapons from anything laying around to figuring out ways to smoke a joint, using like a piece of pencil lead and a metal staple that they found. I mean, really, really amazing creativity in a very constrained environment. And that's important to thinking about kind of creativity and how do you solve problems with constraints. I know a lot of you have already started on the puzzle. I know we had at least one person solve the puzzle. Another person solved the puzzle. Anybody, did you all want to give it one more shot to try to solve it? Or should we move on and get to the answer? Well, how did you solve it? What did you have to do? You had to get outside the box, right? The constraint is you only have this certain number of lines. In order to solve the puzzle, you have to get outside the box. So our guy, Bill Nye here, is going to break down a little bit about problem solving, and he's going to talk through how to solve this problem if you didn't solve it already.
People want to solve problems. That's what we want to do. And you'll hear the expression all the time. Let's just think outside of the box. If you think outside of the box, you'll be creative, you'll solve the problem. Well, I believe that expression is based on an old puzzle that's been around since I was a kid. It looks like this. There are 9 dots arranged in a box. All right, now the rule, the game, is you have to connect all 9 dots with just 4 lines. And let's just say you can't lift your pen, pencil, or stylus off of the page. All right, so let's try it. We get started. We'll go across the top. There's 3 of the dots. Down the side, 3 of the dots. Along the bottom, 3 of the dots. Well, you can't get that last dot on the side and the dot in the middle with just 1 more line. You can't do it. Oh heavens, we are puzzled. We are stuck. But if you try the puzzle again, going outside of the box, you can go like this. Let's go up from the bottom, diagonally to the top, down here along the side. Now go outside of the box. Then come back up across, picking up those 2 dots, and then with just 1 more line, you can get the last dot. Isn't that fabulous? The thinking outside the box comes from the rule, the game, where you're only allowed to have 4 lines of any length. So you got to embrace those constraints and work with them. Constraints are good. They're the rules by which you must play. Think about connecting a bridge from one side of the river to the other. You can't put the bridge just anywhere. It's got to be where the banks will support the ends of the bridge, for example. So constraints are not bad, they just are.
So Bill breaks it down for us, and this idea of thinking outside the box and the idea of constraints. And as I mentioned in that story about the students I used to work with who had very literal constraints around them, it unlocks really interesting kinds of thinking. Now, the term kind of thinking out of the box, it's kind of become a bit of a tired cliche, I think, right? People kind of use it all the time very frivolously. I really like to think about, though, this idea of lateral thinking. And thinking outside of the box is a form of lateral thinking. It's a phrase that was coined by Edward de Bono. And he's got a really great metaphor for this idea of lateral thinking. This idea that, vertical thinking, let's say we're digging a hole to plant a tree, right? And we're kind of hitting rocks and things like that. But we just keep driving further and further down that hole. And we kind of get tunnel vision, right? We're just so focused on this one hole that we started that we start to lose perspective of what's around us. And so lateral thinking is this idea that I'm going to get out of that hole and I'm going to start to explore new places to dig new holes, new approaches to how I might plant that tree. So this idea of lateral thinking is very much about getting outside of that myopic vision and starting to explore the world through some new possibilities, through a new lens or a new frame of reference. And I think this is really interesting. Of course, the idea of lateral thinking predates the hype around generative AI, but I think it's really interesting to think about lateral thinking in the current moment. And the reason why I think this is really interesting is that generative AI is going to develop really deep subject matter expertise, right? It's already really good at taking on a role and you being able to prompt it and kind of have a conversation with it as it represents some sort of expert. And so the dynamic sort of changes now where, as opposed to a real focus around developing very deep disciplinary knowledge, maybe it becomes more valuable for people to develop a broad range of skills and perspectives, right? And that's disruptive to the entire kind of tradition around education, which is that we develop very deep knowledge. We get to college, we have a major, we go into a profession, we have a specific role, and it's all built around a very vertical framework for thinking. But if we have this expert sidekick who we can access at any moment, suddenly it becomes much more valuable to be able to traverse that knowledge landscape with a critical lens, right? Because if you ask your AI assistant to pose as a marketing genius, let's say you're a startup, you haven't hired a marketing person yet, you're a team of two, you got to tap into that marketing knowledge, but you have to have a critical lens because God knows what the thing is going to spit out at you, right? You've got to be able to process it, reprompt it, converse with it to access that knowledge. And so it's a really interesting moment, I think, to think about lateral thinking as a way that's actually disruptive to how we've thought about knowledge paradigms to date. Now, de Bono has a very famous kind of exercise called the 6 hats. The idea here is you're facing a problem, you put on these different hats, each hat is a specific role, a specific kind of way of looking at that problem, and that by putting on these hats, you can see a problem from different angles. Now, conceptually, it's a great idea. The challenge is, again, we've been trained to only wear the one hat. And so a lot of us have trouble putting on that other hat. What AI unlocks here is this idea that the AI can help you wear those different hats. The AI becomes a source of expertise for you to really dig into what that hat represents and how that hat is looking at a particular problem. So how do we activate lateral thinking and learning? Now, the puzzle is a cool example, but we don't want to just sit there doing puzzles all day. I don't think that that's going to help us develop lateral thinking, but what I think is really valuable is this idea of storytelling as a way to activate lateral thinking. And not just any kind of storytelling, but storytelling from amazing people, from very diverse people, people who have diverse types of expertise and knowledge. Storytelling, when we listen to a story, we are seeing the world through that particular perspective, that particular lens. And so it becomes a really powerful way to activate lateral thinking, right? If we think about the neuroscience in storytelling, now the idea that we learn best from stories is ancient, right? There's indigenous wisdom, tell me a fact and I might remember it, tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. Now, modern neuroscience has started to demonstrate just exactly what happens in the brain when we hear a story, right? If I'm listening to a bunch of facts and data, if you look at the brain imaging, it's kind of like a flashlight in the dark, right? It's kind of one speck of light. If you look at that brain image in the context of hearing a story, suddenly that brain is lighting up like fireworks on the 4th of July, right? It's activating your neural coupling. You're in sync with the person you're listening to. Mirroring, we're mirroring, our mirror neurons are activated. We're in sync and listening and picking up the perspectives, the emotion, the feelings of people. Right? It's helping us recall information better. That story is stickier than the facts that we listen to. So much going on in the brain when we hear a story. And I think a really cool example of the power of storytelling, and particularly hearing a story from a really amazing person to learn a very everyday skill, is what if we could learn a power skill from true crime stories, right? True crime, we all love true crime. It's gripping, right? It's sticky, it surprises you, it excites you. And so we're gonna watch a video here from a gentleman named Chris Voss, who was the head of hostage negotiation at the FBI. So Chris is a master of negotiation techniques. We're gonna hear one of the techniques that he used in the FBI.
Hello, this is Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, is this Billy? Hi, Billy, listen, it's very difficult for me to speak to you when you keep putting me on hold like that. We need to keep talking to each other so that we can resolve this and we can get everybody out safely. Okay.
The other guys are talking and they're trying to resolve something.
Okay, I need to know what you're thinking about in
I
there.
can't tell you because nobody's talking yet.
Okay, how is everyone in there?
Everyone's fine.
Everybody's doing fine?
Everyone.
You put one of the ladies on the phone a little bit ago. What was that for? One of the ladies got on the phone a little bit ago and said that she was okay.
Okay.
Okay? Okay, we agree that we're going to get everybody out safely.
Okay, listen.
All right, now you and I are going to work on that together, and we're going to work this out. We're going to bring everybody out safely. All right, Billy?
Okay, let me talk to them and I come back to you.
No, don't put me on hold now, Billy. Hi, is this Billy? This is Chris. My name is Chris. You gonna come out now?
I want to end it.
Okay.
Boom.
So what I'm going to teach you with mirrors and a section on mirroring is how to use mirrors to get the other side engaged, to get them to feel like they're involved, and also to tease out the information that you might not have had otherwise, the pieces of information that are going to make all the difference in the world. It's just a simple repetition of 1 to 3 words, 1 to 3-ish words. Typically, it's the last 1 to 3 words of what somebody said. But when you get good at mirroring, you could pick 1 to 3 words from anywhere in the conversation. The other person feels listened to. It tends to connect their thoughts in their head. If you mirror, you will be ridiculously interesting to other people because you're interested in them.
So we're seeing a situation from the perspective of an FBI hostage negotiator, right? And we're hearing the actual audio recording of him using this mirroring technique in a hostage situation, right? And then we see him actually kind of break down that skill. And now this is a skill that we can use in our everyday lives. And he actually gives examples in his class about how he uses it with his teenage daughter, or how you might use it to negotiate a raise with your boss, right? So this idea of seeing the world through the perspective of a hostage negotiator and applying that skill in another context is activating that kind of lateral thinking. It's a really interesting example of that. Another cool example of that is from the great Jane Goodall, right? The great activist. Now, she goes in front of lobbyists and Congress to fight for funding for environmental issues, to fight for policy reform. And that's a challenging thing to do, right? It's hard to get money out of people. Everybody's asking them for money. And so how does she kind of get recognized by people? How does she kind of activate their emotions and the powers of persuasion? Well, let's hear from Jane kind of break down how she uses storytelling as a way to actually connect with people and get their attention.
My approach has always been to try and reach into people's hearts, and the only way I can do that is by telling stories. For example, I've been around Capitol Hill quite a lot, talking to various senators and congressmen, and usually it's a very rushed thing, and you get maybe 10 minutes max. And I know from talking to various lobbyists that people go in and they plunge straight into their thing and they've got it all lined up, and but I can't do that. I have to make, even if it's only 1 minute, make some kind of relationship. Who is it I'm talking to? I hear you have a dog, or something I've learned about them, and I introduce that. So there's a relaxing, and once somebody's relaxed, then it's also important to listen to anything they have to say. Like, I can't stand you animal welfare people because, and then you know exactly how to get in, how to try and reach the heart, because you can't, with these people who are battered day after day after day, these decision makers, these CEOs, these people in government, people are at them all the time. And it must get so awfully boring and must be very difficult to be patient. And so it has to be done a different way. The only way I know is to get people on your side and have sympathy, and I can't do that except by telling the right story at the right time.
So again, she's speaking from the context of an advocate talking to government. But this is a lesson that we use to teach executives how to communicate your strategy to your employees, or how to help salespeople sell a product. I mean, we're walking around going booth to booth out there, right? And they've got 1 minute of time to pitch you their product, and they're going to kind of throw that pitch at you, right? But what if they switched the paradigm a little bit and actually tried to engage you emotionally first, hooked you with that story, right? I think the ones that do it really well are really effective of getting you to stop for a moment, as opposed to kind of rushing and taking their flyer or taking their piece of candy and getting to the next booth, right? So it's a great example how, again, looking at the world through the lens of Jane Goodall here, we actually can build a skill that's really valuable in a lot of different contexts. Now, how we think about teaching stories as we build curricula at MasterClass, what we try to do is start off by kind of stating what is that skill or the technique. So when we think about Chris Voss, he kind of opens up his class with kind of this technique of mirroring, right? What is mirroring? Why is it valuable? Then he gets into the provocative story. You kind of hear him using that in a real world situation with high stakes, right? It's triggering your emotions. It's getting those antennas up and interested. Then he gets into the explicit instruction. So step by step, how do you do the skill or technique of mirroring, repeating 1 to 3 words at the end of what somebody said. Then describing it across multiple contexts. So again, he's in the context of the hostage negotiator, but he flips that lens to negotiating with a teenage daughter, or you're negotiating with your boss. And then we try to summarize and restate. So this is a formula that we find to be really effective because it triggers that emotional response. It cuts through the noise of all the other media that people are distracted by, and then helps you kind of build that skill, a skill that you can apply in your role at work. Now, we were going to do a little bit of an activity here. I think we're going to skip it just because the room is so crowded. I was going to have you pair up, one person share a story, the other person try to mirror them. It probably would have went real haywire in this room. But try mirroring at some point during the conference. You might find that you're the most interesting person in the room simply by mirroring what other people say. And then don't do it to somebody who's in the room here, because they're going to pick up on the fact that you're trying to mirror them. I've actually been in a room with Chris Voss before, and he was doing the moves on me. And I was like, I know the moves, man. I've seen the class. But it's just second nature, and then you almost just start to forget about it, and it sucks you right in. It's kind of amazing. So we'll come back to the activity if we have time. But the other thing about stories, right, that I think is really interesting is that they can disrupt our patterned ways of thinking. Again, you know, when we think about our brains, right, our brains are not like, you know, people say like, oh, he's super smart. His brain's like a sponge. It just soaks everything up, right? It's not a great metaphor for what our brains are doing. Our brains are not indiscriminately soaking up H2O, you know, all the same molecules, right? It's processing lots of different kinds of sensory inputs, and it's constructing, it's making connections between neurons. It's creating associations in our brain to our past experience. It's prioritizing information. Is it relevant to me in this moment, or is it something that, you know, I'm just going to forget about right away? So the brain is actively processing the world, and in doing so, to make sense of the world, it tries to fit things into patterns. It tries to fit things into associations, and that's how we get that kind of tunnel vision. So we want to kind of break those patterns, and one of the great ways to do that through storytelling is the element of surprise, right? How often do we talk about surprise in the context of our learning environments? Right? As we've kind of modeled learning environments more in terms of like consumer tech, I think we've kind of lost the idea that learning is a very disruptive process. It's not like checking out at Amazon, right? Amazon, when you're in the checkout flow, they don't want you to be thinking. As soon as you start thinking about your purchase, you stop your purchase, right? As soon as there's some friction, you're like, wait, why am I buying this, right? So they want it to be super smooth. I don't think learning should always be super smooth. I think it should be a little bit disruptive. It should be a little bit jarring, a little bit surprising. You know, one of the areas we've recently been exploring at MasterClass at Work is supporting people who are working in frontline retail contexts, right? So you go to a sporting goods store, and you've got the kid in the store who's trying to sell you a pair of sneakers, right? And they don't, first, it's been a really underserved population or segment of the workforce. They haven't had a lot of access to learning and development. And when they do, it tends to be like these really dry, boring videos, or they're kind of safety video, compliance videos. And so how do you kind of get them excited about their job? How do you help them develop kind of key soft skills and durable skills to help them do their jobs better and to grow as people? Well, one of the things that you try to teach kind of people working customer service is empathy, right? How do you empathize with a customer? Now, you can't teach empathy with 3 bullet points in a PowerPoint slide. That's not how you teach empathy. You teach empathy by listening to people's stories, and you want to hear those stories from people who you recognize, who excite you. And so imagine you're that kid, you clock in for the day, you're getting ready to interact with customers, and you're going to learn about empathy on your mobile from Alicia Keys. And Alicia Keys is going to teach you a little bit about how she thinks about and uses empathy as a musician.
I think empathy is like one of the most powerful emotional experiences, because empathy means that you can actually put yourself in the place of another and understand what they may be feeling and feel it with them, understand it with them, live it with them. We live in a time where, you know, many people choose to try to tear down or to disencourage or to be negative. And it's such a power, it's such a superpower to find your empathy, to find the way you relate to each other, to people you don't know, to people you've never met, to circumstances you've never experienced. If you can empathize with them, if you can connect and understand them and appreciate them for what they are, I think it's really powerful.
So imagine that kid, right? You start to think, well, who's going to pop up tomorrow, right? Who's going to surprise me in this experience? And we actually use like a drop cadence in our product for these frontline workers, where each day they get access to kind of 1 or 2 very short form videos as a way to just kind of activate that skill, get them to think about that skill. And it really plays on this idea, old kind of operant conditioning, Skinner's idea of variable reward, right? I mean, this is how TikTok works, right? TikTok doesn't start with the best video and then give you the next best video and the next best video and the next best video, right? What it does is, like, every 5th video, it gives you the video that it thinks is going to be the best video. Because that element of surprise, right? That's what Skinner found in his rats, is that when they weren't sure when that food was going to come, that actually optimized their behavior, right? The variable reward is a key way to drive a kind of behavior, and we use that in this idea of kind of dropping different people, different stories at different moments. And what that starts to do, when you think about the people on that screen, you have athletes, you have film directors, you have musicians, you have business people. You start to see the world and construct the world more like a cubist painting, right? A cubist painting takes an object, or it takes a face, and it paints that object from many different perspectives on the same plane, right? That's what cubism is. And it's an amazing way to kind of deconstruct the world, because again, when we're looking at the world through that single perspective, that's the myopic vision, right? How do you deconstruct that? And if you think about the world today, in our filter bubbles, in the algorithms that are constructing our news feeds, we're becoming more and more narrow in our view of the world. And so this idea of the cubist painting is a very cool metaphor for thinking about bringing together these very diverse perspectives around an issue. Another way we've done that is to actually kind of stitch these different instructors together into a single clip. And so in this particular clip, you're going to learn how to problem solve from a scientist, CEO, mathematician, actor, entrepreneur. Now, there is not one person who is all of those things, but we start to link them together. So we already heard from Bill Nye from the science perspective. Then, in this particular video, next we're going to hear from Indra Nui, who's a CEO, former consultant. She talks about when you're looking at a solution in a problem space to zoom in and out of the problem. So look really close at the micro context and then zoom back out to the macro context. We hear from a mathematician, Terence Tao, who talks about how mathematicians approach abstract problems by actually contextualizing that problem in a story. So the story gives it a context, it helps them focus their problem solving. Then we hear from LeVar Burton, the Reading Rainbow guy, right? He brings such joy and the imagination. He just asks this simple question, what if? What if you just ask yourself, what if, right? This idea that creativity, problem solving, to ask yourself that question. And then we close with a guy who's done some really, really interesting problem solving, and that's Richard Branson. We're going to hear a quick clip from Richard Branson on how he solved a really big problem when he was at Virgin Airlines.
We wanted to be the first airline in the world to introduce seat-back videos into the seats of our planes. It was going to cost us about $10 million to do it. We went to the banks, and the banks wouldn't lend us the $10 million. And we were absolutely convinced that seatback videos is what kids would want, what everybody would want. And we wanted to be some years ahead of British Airways, our main competitor. And I remember just lying in bed one night, just looking up at the ceiling, desperately trying to think how we could get $10 million. And then I had an idea, and this was, because it was nighttime, it was on Los Angeles time, so I picked up the phone to Boeing, and I said, I'm thinking of buying 10 brand new 747-400s from you. Would you include the seatback videos in the backs of the seats as part of us buying the planes? And they said, well, we're delighted that you want to buy these planes, and I'm sure that we could organize that. Cut a long story short, we were able to borrow $2 billion to get the planes, whereas we couldn't borrow $10 million for seatback videos. So sometimes, if you think really big, you can actually solve your smaller problem.
So now talk about lateral thinking, right? There's Richard Branson laying in bed. I'm sure it's a very nice bed, and he's laying there, and he's and if he was in a vertical thinking mode, he would have just kept thinking about how do I kind of pitch this idea in a different way to get this 10 million, and you would have been stuck on the 10 million. Instead, lateral thinking, let me dig a new hole. Well, what if I ask for 2 billion and get a bunch of new jumbo jets, right? And so, to just go back really quickly, right? That kind of completes the circle, right? He had a set of constraints. He was zooming in and out of the problem. He's thinking about it from the perspective of a story, the power that it will be to have these young kids in the back of planes watching seatback video. He's laying in bed and he's got his chess pieces, and he's asking himself, what if? And then boom, he figures out, he solves the problem. So the last part that's really important to lateral thinking, and De Bono talks about this as well, is, we talked about the patterns in our brain and how they shape our thinking. And so we have to become self-aware of our own thinking patterns. It's not just we're looking outward at the world trying to solve problems, but we have to be introspective and reflective about the way that we construct the world, our social construction of reality. That's really important, and we can really think about that in the context of metacognition, right? Such an important part of the learning process, to think about one's own thinking. And that's going to help us unlock new ways of thinking, because as we reflect on those patterns and understand them, we know how to break them. We know how to move away from them. We know how to dig another hole, so to speak. And so the last video we're going to close with is from Esther Perel, the psychotherapist, who's going to talk a little bit about this idea of self-awareness and becoming aware of the narratives that we tell ourselves, and how we can overcome those narratives and write new stories for ourselves.
Self-awareness involves, first of all, the idea that you can look at yourself and how you are acting and reacting in relationships, how you are communicating in a relationship, how you are showing up, or how you are not and avoiding. That piece of self-knowledge is also what gives you a sense of looking at others and being able to understand them. In talking about self-awareness, there is the implication of know thyself. And so many of us will think, I know myself, I know my story. But sometimes the stories that we tell about ourselves also have the risk of becoming rigid, repetitious, narrow, reductionistic. And they actually become a truth in and of themselves just because we keep telling them. But that doesn't mean that it's the only story that exists about us. So when you look at your own relational self-awareness, watch out not to fall into the trap of constricting narratives about yourselves, about your relationships, about others that don't allow you for actual relational self-awareness.
So as you return back into the maelstrom of the conference out there, take that moment to think about your story. Take a moment to think about the stories that others tell about you. And think about how you might reframe that story in a new way and adopt a new perspective, adopt a new approach to what you're doing in business or what you're doing with your family or what you're doing in any aspect of your life. And so in closing, I think those 3 key points when it comes to kind of activating lateral thinking, and again, lateral thinking being this really valuable, important skill in this kind of age of generative AI, is think about those great stories. And it doesn't have to be famous people. Think about the stories in your organization, the amazing stories that people bring with them, the diverse perspectives people bring with them. Activate those stories. Bring that element of surprise. Jar people out of the noise, the media noise that's constantly humming in our brains, and you know, make that kind of moment of disruption. And then be sure to always be reflective of yourself. Understand your own pattern ways of thinking and find new ways to approach the world. And so we've got a couple minutes left for questions. You also can scan the QR code to get free access for, I think, 30 days maybe, or 3 months, I'm not sure. But you can check out some of the videos that you got to see a bit of a preview here today. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming. We'll open it up for questions. I think there's a burning question in the back. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, so the great example, I didn't show his video, but Terence Tao, the mathematician, actually talks about when mathematicians approach a very abstract problem, one of the first things they do is refactor that problem into a concrete story. And the story gives it a really clear context, so that when they're solving that problem, they're actually thinking about the human element. And I think it's right, it's such a valuable skill for our engineers and our mathematicians, because they're solving problems for people. And if we forget about the people, then we end up aligning the wrong solution to the problem. So thinking in terms of stories and making stories a part of how we teach mathematics and hard skills, and also how actually we deploy those skills in our everyday lives, I think is really important. And Terence Tao is a great example of that. Yeah. All right, thank you. We've got 2.5 minutes left. I know everybody's probably running to the next one because the lines get crazy, but happy to hang around for a couple minutes for any questions. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all.